Napoleon Bonaparte was a military genius, a conqueror of Europe, a man whose mere gesture could make an entire army tremble. But when it came to love, he was just another hopeless romantic, experiencing the highest peaks of happiness and the deepest pits of heartbreak. From his failed first love with Désirée Clary to his toxic yet passionate marriage with Joséphine, and finally to his COD-delivered marriage with Marie Louise, Napoleon went through every shade of love, giving his all, being cheated on, and even getting abandoned without a second thought. On the battlefield, Napoleon was invincible. But in love? That was a completely different story. Let's dive into the romantic journey of the emperor who was mighty on horseback but weak in matters of the heart, proving that even a man who conquered the world could be defeated by a woman in an instant. Désirée Clary, the first love who was abandoned but made the greatest comeback. Think Napoleon was the ultimate ladies' man in history? Think again. There was a time he dumped a girl to chase after a more passionate love, only for that girl to become the Queen of Sweden. Yes, you heard that right. This is the story of Désirée Clary, the woman who was left behind but made one of the most legendary comebacks in history. Our story begins in 1794, when Napoleon was just an unknown French officer, and Désirée was a beautiful young lady from a wealthy silk merchant family in Marseille. Désirée had an older sister, Julie, who married Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother. Naturally, Désirée was matched with Napoleon. At first, they got along well. Désirée even got engaged to him, thinking she was about to become the noblewoman standing proudly beside the man of her dreams. She imagined a blissful life with her husband and children running around a grand chateau. While Désirée was lost in her fairy tale, Napoleon had a fateful encounter with Joséphine de Beauharnais, a charming, wealthy widow with far more romantic experience than young Désirée. The result? Désirée was unceremoniously dumped. And worse? She never even received a breakup letter. Napoleon simply vanished from her life, chasing after his new love without a word. Désirée was utterly bewildered. One day, upon hearing the news that Napoleon had married Joséphine, she was so shocked that she fainted, just like in a dramatic historical drama. Proof that understanding a man's heart is like searching for a needle in a haystack. After being abandoned by Napoleon, Désirée lost faith in love. But fate had other plans. She met Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a dashing and ambitious French general with great potential in the military. Humph, Napoleon dumped me? No problem. I'll marry another general, maybe even one better than him. And so, in 1798, Désirée married Bernadotte. Their marriage was relatively stable, despite Bernadotte being busy with his military career and Désirée occasionally reminiscing about her ex years later. Bernadotte was chosen to become the King of Sweden, and Désirée automatically became the Queen. The girl once discarded by Napoleon now had an entire kingdom of her own. Ironically, when Napoleon fell from power and was exiled, Bernadotte, Désirée's husband, was one of his strongest opponents. And Désirée? She couldn't care less about her ex and enjoyed her life as Queen of Sweden. The only catch? She disliked the cold Swedish climate and actually preferred staying in Paris. She only moved to Stockholm after her husband had ruled for nearly 20 years. Désirée Clary may have been abandoned by Napoleon, but she had the most spectacular revenge by becoming the queen of a nation where her husband ruled for 26 years. In fact, the Bernadotte dynasty still reigns over Sweden to this day. The moral of the story? Don't be heartbroken if your ex leaves you, because you just might become a queen while they end up exiled on an island. A truly satisfying ending for Désirée, don't you think? Joséphine and Napoleon, a passionate but tragic love story. If Napoleon's relationship with Désirée Clary was a dramatic plot twist, then his love story with Joséphine was like a romantic film filled with both passion and heartbreak. Let's take a look at how this turbulent love affair unfolded. The story begins in 1795, when Napoleon was still an unknown but ambitious young general. At a social gathering, he met Joséphine, a widow 6 years older than him, with 2 children and a reputation for irresistible charm. Wow, this lady is different. All of Paris is enamored with her, but I will be the one to win her heart. Meanwhile, Joséphine looked at Napoleon and thought, this guy is a bit short, but he has a promising future. And just like that, love blossomed between them, despite Napoleon already being engaged to Désirée at the time. Napoleon fell madly in love. He wrote hundreds of passionate love letters, as if he were experiencing his first romance, pouring out words so sweet that they could make anyone cringe. One of his most famous lines to Joséphine was, "I cannot sleep, I cannot eat. I think only of you. I love you like a madman." At the same time, Joséphine was drowning in debt, so marrying a rising young general was also a smart financial move for her. And so, in 1796, they officially tied the knot. Even their wedding was a memorable event. Joséphine arrived late, and Napoleon mistakenly wrote the wrong date on the marriage certificate. A rather chaotic start for such a legendary love story. Immediately after the wedding, Napoleon left for battle in Italy, while Joséphine stayed behind in Paris, enjoying lavish parties. Napoleon constantly wrote to her, always starting his letters with, "Joséphine, you do not reply to my letters. What are you doing?" But Joséphine was too busy partying, and even worse, too busy having an affair with a handsome young officer named Hippolyte Charles. When Napoleon discovered that his wife had cheated on him, he was devastated. Yet, despite the betrayal, he still loved Joséphine and continued to forgive her. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France, and naturally, Joséphine became Empress. This brings us to one of the most dramatic coronations in history. The most dramatic coronation in history. On December 2, 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte officially ascended the throne as Emperor of France in what was one of the grandest yet most unconventional coronations in history. If you think coronations are solemn, traditional events filled with humility, then Napoleon was certainly not one to follow the norm. He made sure everything was about him, he was the main character, and everyone else was just a supporting role. Instead of holding the ceremony in Reims, where French kings had traditionally been crowned, Napoleon chose the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Everything was extravagant beyond imagination. Renowned artists designed the royal attire, painted portraits, and transformed the cathedral into a grand stage fitting for Napoleon's vision. As for the guest list, over 10,000 people crammed into the cathedral, nobles, generals, and even representatives from European nations, all gathered not only to witness history but also to see what Napoleon would do next. As a newly declared legitimate emperor, Napoleon invited Pope Pius VII from Rome to officiate the anointing ceremony and place the crown on his head. But here's the twist, Napoleon had no intention of kneeling before anyone. Traditionally, the Pope would crown the king, signifying that the ruler's power came from God. But Napoleon had a different mindset. No one has the right to crown me except myself. And as expected, at the crucial moment, instead of allowing the Pope to place the crown on his head, Napoleon took the crown himself and placed it on his own head. The entire audience was stunned. Wait, so did he invite the Pope all the way here just to make him a background character? Beside Napoleon, Joséphine, both lucky and unfortunate, was officially crowned empress. But things were not as smooth as they seemed. To be recognized as empress, Joséphine had to secretly remarry Napoleon in a religious ceremony because the church had discovered that their original marriage was only a civil union. On the night before the ceremony, Joséphine was so overwhelmed that she broke down in tears. She knew her relationship with Napoleon was not as passionate as before. But despite her fears, she stepped onto the coronation stage, accepted the crown, and became the Empress of France. Her worries were not unfounded, as it wasn't long before Napoleon left her for another woman. When the coronation ended, witnesses reported hearing Napoleon murmur to Joséphine, "Now, I am emperor. But in truth, I have been emperor for a long time." In summary, Napoleon's coronation was a grand, unconventional, and dramatic spectacle. No one but Napoleon could come up with such an extravagant way to assert his power. He may very well have been the first overbearing CEO in history. A heartbreaking farewell. After becoming emperor, Napoleon faced a significant issue. Joséphine could not bear him an heir. And so, he was forced to make the most painful decision of his life. In 1810, Napoleon had to divorce Joséphine, even though he still deeply loved her. During the divorce ceremony, both of them wept bitterly, and Napoleon signed the papers in utter sorrow. Afterward, he married Marie Louise, an Austrian princess, and had a son. But despite moving on, Napoleon never truly let go of Joséphine. He continued to send letters asking about her well-being, and in his final moments, as he lay on his deathbed, his last words were, "France, the army, Joséphine." Even at the end of his life, Joséphine still held an irreplaceable place in his heart. Marie Louise, the empress who was shipped to Napoleon. After his dramatic love affair with Joséphine, Napoleon decided he needed a new wife. But this time, he didn't seek passionate love or a romantic marriage. No, this was purely a political marriage, something like, "I need an empress. But not for love. I need someone who can bear an heir." And so, after careful strategic calculations, in 1810, Napoleon married Marie Louise, the Austrian princess, a young, beautiful girl who had no choice in the matter. This story sounds like a package being delivered to a customer who has no right to refuse, and the package was Marie Louise. Marie Louise was born in 1791, the granddaughter of Emperor Francis II of Austria and a descendant of the prestigious Habsburg dynasty. But there was a big problem: Napoleon and Austria were sworn enemies. Napoleon had defeated Austria multiple times, even humiliating them in the Treaty of Pressburg. By this time, Napoleon was 40 years old and urgently needed a wife who could produce an heir. He considered two candidates, a Russian princess, but Russia was too proud and refused to marry off their daughter to Napoleon. Marie Louise of Austria. Austria, being weaker, had no choice but to agree. And so, on March 11, 1810, a long-distance wedding took place. Marie Louise didn't attend. Instead, a representative stood in for her and married Napoleon in her place. Once it was done, Marie Louise was shipped to Paris like a royal package. Upon arriving in France, Marie Louise was given a grand reception by Napoleon. But she had no feelings for him. In a letter to her friends, she wrote, "My husband is an old man, but at least he treats me well." Having suffered enough heartbreak over Joséphine's inability to bear children, Napoleon wasted no time with Marie Louise. On their wedding night, he immediately fulfilled his duty to ensure they had a child as soon as possible. Less than a year later, in 1811, Marie Louise gave birth to a son, Napoleon II, also known as the King of Rome. Napoleon was ecstatic, declaring, "At last, I have an heir. My empire will last forever." But he was wrong. In 1814, Napoleon was defeated by the Allied forces and exiled to the island of Elba. At that moment, Marie Louise had a choice: follow her husband into exile or stay in Austria and live a comfortable life. Without hesitation, she chose Austria. Not only did she refuse to follow Napoleon, but she also quickly found a new lover, Count Adam Neipperg, an Austrian nobleman. While Napoleon suffered in lonely exile, Marie Louise was enjoying life with her new man. Marie Louise could be considered the fastest turncoat empress in history, but it was understandable: hers was a purely political marriage. As for Napoleon, though he dearly loved his son, he never saw him again. His son, Napoleon II, was raised as an Austrian prince and never had a chance to inherit the French throne. It was a rather heartbreaking ending for Napoleon. Though he conquered all of Europe with his armies, love conquered him with devastating emotional blows. Désirée left to become Queen of Sweden, Joséphine cheated on him, and Marie Louise jumped ship the moment he fell from power. In short, military strategies don't apply to matters of the heart. Perhaps if Napoleon had written a memoir about love, it would be titled, "Being an Emperor is easy, but keeping a lover is hard." No matter how brutal the battlefield was, nothing hurt more than being betrayed by the ones he loved. And maybe, on those long nights in exile, he thought to himself, "If only I could command a woman's heart as easily as I command my army." But whether he won or lost in love, Napoleon remains in history as a great emperor, one who sat on a glorious throne yet was utterly defeated in romance.